Welcome back, everybody. If you're new here, my name is Douglas Johnson, and I am a yoga and meditation instructor, ordained minister, kirtan artist. And if you're interested in spirituality, especially the deep end of the spirituality pool, then you're in the right place. Please subscribe, like, and comment. All right, so today I wanted to discuss one of the best techniques or methods or ways of getting out of a funk, getting out of a dark night of the soul, of being able to feel reconnected with Source, with God, with love, with life. And it's a very, very powerful thing, and it's often overlooked, I find. But for me personally, this is how I recently, as some of you may know if you've been following along with my videos, I recently experienced a dark night of the soul. I had an experience with an individual who I felt really connected with, and unfortunately, the situation didn't really work out the way that I was hoping it would. And I didn't realize this would happen, but it definitely led to a dark night experience, an experience of feeling disconnected, of questioning, life and value and what's going on in life. And so I wanted to share with you this method or this way that I have found to get out of that feeling of disconnection, of disillusionment, which is, again, a lot of times what accompanies a dark night, is this feeling of disconnection. And we question many, many things about our life and experience. So the method or the practice, or however you want to think of it, is service. So serving others, serving God, service. Now, in the yoga tradition, this is often talked about in terms of karma yoga. So let's explore that avenue or that way of doing this. The most common way that karma yoga is spoken about in the yoga tradition is selfless service, Seva. And the idea is that one does service to another or a community or some kind of service, but without expectation of compensation. So you basically would, like volunteering at a homeless shelter or volunteering in some way, is considered seva or selfless service. So this is one practice that we can do, and I absolutely advocate for that practice. So if you have an opportunity, if you feel called or inclined to do this, then this is a great way to practice service. Serving God, interestingly, and again, if you're allergic to that word God, it's not really that important to me. I don't conceive of God as this wise being sitting in the clouds judging us. I know that's how many people might see it. When I use that word, that's not really what I am intending. You could say serving love, helping love extend and expand. This is another way we can think about what I'm talking about. So how do we serve love? How do we serve God? Well, I think it is by doing service to others. So I feel like the Christian faith has a pretty good grasp on this concept. And very often Christians are involved in doing good works, helping others. Now, sometimes that's tied with a missionary sort of approach, which in my mind, it actually diminishes the good that it'll do. because what people are really trying to do is a sort of exchange. I give you food, or I give you goods, or I give you shelter, but then you have to listen to me talk about my beliefs, my conception of God. And that diminishes the value, because again, the real purpose here is to serve God's creation and to let, in a sense, God work through you. Now, I understand that Christians think that that's what they are doing when they are proselytizing or trying to convert somebody. That is their belief system. But in my experience, that's really not necessarily actually serving love, not in a pure sense. So serving and doing good works, these can be very overt in the sense of maybe we go to a homeless shelter, we volunteer, and again, nothing wrong with that. But serving others is actually something we can do moment to moment. So in an exchange or interaction with somebody, this relates somewhat with my talk about great doubt and great faith, in that we might be tempted to see that person or view that person in a negative light. And when we choose not to do that, we are serving them in a sense. We are seeing them at their best. And maybe they've never actually been at their best, but we are giving them the benefit of the doubt. We are really trying to assume that the love of God is there inside of them and that they can access that. And we want to sort of see them at their best. And by doing that, we are serving them. So another way that this shows up is seeing the divine in everyone and everything. So again, volunteering at a homeless shelter, feeding the poor, these are kind of overt ways of service or selfless service. But what about if we have a child and they are behaving poorly or badly? What if we were to try and see them as the divine? What if we assumed that our baby was baby Jesus or baby Krishna? And instead of assuming that their behavior is the worst or antagonistic or selfish, we actually assume that maybe there's a divine inspiration behind it, that maybe they're actually challenging us or testing us to see what if we can rise to the occasion to be our best self. And this doesn't have to be a child, of course. It can be a partner. I think practicing this with your partner is a great way to practice it. And so, again, instead of assuming the worst motivation, selfishness, assuming that somebody is motivated by the worst parts of themselves, you choose, and this is a choice, this is a mindfulness practice, this is something that we have to sort of slow down and choose to do. We choose to see them in the best light possible. And in A Course in Miracles, which again is a scripture that I really advocate for, I advocate studying and reading and learning from, because I think it's a very powerful text. In A Course in Miracles, they very specifically say we need to ask for another way of seeing the situation, that our ego brings to us what we want to see. So if we see an evil world, we see selfish children, we see selfish partners, we see awful situations, then that's actually what we're asking the ego to bring to us. We're asking to see that. I know that that's not how we conventionally think. But this is why spirituality is not about conventional thinking. We have to make this abundantly clear. If we're interested in conventional thought, then we shouldn't be listening to a spiritual teacher. Because a spiritual teacher, by definition, is not going to give you conventional thought. So, again, what is the world I'm experiencing? This is a reflection of, on some deep level, what I am wanting to see and experience. So, if I see a world full of evil, full of sinners, full of hate, then what the Course is inviting us to do is to recognize that this is actually what we are calling to our attention. We're inviting this into our perception. It's not necessarily the only interpretation of the reality that we live in. And so what it encourages us to do is to ask Spirit for another way of interpreting events, people, situations. So when we find ourselves suffering because the world is such an awful place, because people are not treating us the way that we'd like to be treated, whatever the situation might be, we are encouraged, again, to ask for another way of seeing this. And the reason for that is if we knew another way of seeing it, we would have seen it that way already. So if our own perception or interpretation is accurate, we would already be seeing things in a different way. So we have to sort of stop and recognize and then invite in another perspective. So one of the possible interpretations of other people is that both they and you were created by the divine source of love, of goodness. Now, again, this is not something I'm going to try and logically argue for, because I don't think you can logically argue for it. If we look at the world and we look at quote unquote facts, we take snapshots of reality, then it's very hard to logically argue. Not saying it's impossible, but I certainly don't want to argue it today. It's very hard to argue for, ultimate love or goodness. Again, I'm not saying it's not possible. There are arguments we can make for and against that perspective. But generally speaking, spirituality is something that's experienced by individuals. And that experience overrides this sort of logical perspective of what's going on here, the perceived reality. We experience something deeper or beyond the perceived reality. And when we have access to that and we see that, that sort of changes what we think is real or what is possible. And so this is the very essence of spirituality, spiritual teaching. It doesn't really matter the tradition. This is basically how it goes. Again, if we're talking about conventional viewpoints, conventional reality, then we're certainly not talking about spirituality, right? If I can point to it and measure it and see it and talk about it, then we're not really talking about spirituality. We're talking about science or facts or logic. And there's nothing wrong with that. But this is a channel about spirituality. I am a spiritual teacher. And so that's where I'm going to keep the emphasis. So when we experience this other reality, again, it sort of changes. We see that the one way we perceive the world isn't necessarily the only way of perceiving it, that there can be another interpretation to what's happening. And so another interpretation of individuals is, again, that they are God, or that they have God inside them, or that their actions or words or behavior is actually divinely inspired. And when we invite in this perspective, we are opening our mind to another interpretation of reality, because reality is just reality. It's not good or bad. It just is. And the same can be said about God. God just is. And so reality just is, and we filter reality through our senses, through our mind, through our perceptions, through our past experiences. We filter it, and then we tend to judge it, good or bad. So this is pointed to in Scripture with the teaching about the Garden of Eden. So it's said that in the Garden of Eden, humans ate of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So this is very significant for us, because before that, humans didn't have knowledge of good and evil. They didn't judge. It's not their place to judge. It's not our place to judge. And I've spoken quite a bit about judgment in the past. So judgment doesn't make us happy. It doesn't really serve us in the way that we might think that it does. So most of us believe we need judgment. Most of us believe we need the ego. Most of us believe we need fear. And I'm not talking about biological fear, but psychological fear, that we need fear to motivate us. So I'm not really here to try and convince you that you don't need those things. But if you have come to the conclusion on your own and you realize that those things aren't actually serving you, then this talk is for you. In my experience, and again, from the scriptures that I read, it's quite clear that those things don't serve us. This doesn't mean that when we realize this, those thoughts, those ideas, those experiences will immediately disappear. In my experience, they won't. Again, what we gradually need to do is keep inviting in a different way of seeing and experiencing people and the world. And so we do that. We ask or pray for another way of seeing and experiencing the world. And when we do that, we open our mind, then something else can come in. Before we do that, generally we're closed off and we just believe that we're seeing things as they are. That's usually the argument. Well, I'm just stating facts. I'm just seeing it as it is. And I understand that. I understand that perspective or that belief. But again, that's not really what spirituality is about. Spirituality is about opening us up to another dimension, another perspective, another way of experiencing life that leads to joy, compassion, love, bliss, Sat Chit Ananda. It's a deeper truth. As one of my teachers once told me, a myth is a lie told in service of a greater truth. So yes, a myth or something that spirituality teaches may on the surface seem to be a lie or a half-truth, or like we're denying reality, but really we are trying to get in touch with a deeper truth, a deeper reality, you might say, the reality that sustains and holds this one. So back to this idea of serving others. This is one way that we can serve others, is just the people that are in our lives. Not a homeless person, not a destitute person, but our children, our spouse, our coworkers, our boss. This is a powerful, powerful practice. Can I begin to see them as serving divine love and see that I do not need to oppose them or fight against them or judge them? This is a powerful, powerful practice that we can do at any time. Again, we don't need to move to an ashram. We don't need to take time out of our weekend to volunteer at a homeless shelter. We don't need to find destitute groups of people And then, again, there's nothing wrong with doing all of those things, but my interest has always been on how can we make very deep spirituality and practices accessible to everybody, not just a few, not just people that have the time and the luxury of, say, having a weekend free where they can volunteer. That is a type of luxury. It sounds like you're doing good for others, and you are, but at the same time, it is a luxury that many people cannot afford, okay? So instead, taking your own life, taking the people in your life, and beginning to see them in a better light, serving them. Again, if you all of a sudden found out that your boss was the reincarnation of Jesus or Krishna or a divine being or a very enlightened being, you might interpret all of their behavior completely differently, the same behavior. And this is what often happens with guru yoga, what's called guru yoga, where the teacher is seen as an incarnation of the divine. This is a type of practice. And so I actually don't necessarily recommend practicing it with a teacher, a spiritual teacher at this point in time, but practicing it with your loved ones, with your coworkers, with your boss, seeing if you can see their actions as divinely inspired, or even that individual as divine, and then serving them to the best of your ability. This is a very different way of looking at your day when you go to work and just say, oh my God, my boss is such an idiot, and she asked me to do this and that, and doesn't she know it should be like that? And again, that perspective, while conventionally it might be true and we might be quote unquote right, it doesn't actually serve to make us happy. So if you make those judgments and you can change the situation, beautiful. You can quit, you can go to another job, you can do something else. But what happens when you can't quit? What happens when it's your child? You can't trade out your child for a new child. You can try punishing them. You can try making them feel guilty, shaming them. But what research shows is, generally speaking, all you're really doing is damaging your child. You're not actually improving them by doing those sorts of things. So an alternative is, again, to see them as divine and to actually serve them as best as you can, okay? And again, it just is a perspective that we invite in. We invite in this perspective, and we try and practice following what that perspective tells us. So another aspect of this that I'd like to touch on is our gifts. Many of us have gifts that we've been given since birth. These are talents. They are things that we are just naturally very talented at or good at. And many of us in our culture, because our culture sort of worships money and success and fame, many of us try and figure out how can we use our talents to line our pockets, to get famous on Instagram or YouTube or wherever it is, to make more money. And this is, again, very conventional. And I'm not trying to say this is wrong or evil or bad or that you shouldn't do it. It's fine. But another option is to ask yourself, how can I use this talent to serve others? And this is, again, something that in my experience can really open doors and lead us out of the dark night, lead us away from depression, lead us away from anxiety, because we aren't focusing on ourselves anymore. And we're not really focused on whether or not others seem to be appreciating what we're doing. We move out into the world with a different perspective. And this perspective is spoken about in the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of my favorite scriptures, sacred texts. In the Gita, Krishna basically tells Arjuna at some point to perform action without attachment to the outcomes of that action. And I think that this is a really enlightened perspective. Can we take our talents, our gifts, and just offer them up in service to others? Paid or unpaid doesn't really matter to me. I'm not really that concerned with whether you're receiving money for it or not. I know with selfless service, Seva, technically you're supposed to not accept any money. But for me, that doesn't really matter. It's more the spirit in which you're doing something. So again, your job, if you have a talent for something, but maybe you feel that your job is unfulfilling in some way, or that you're not recognized in your job or appreciated in your job. These are really things that the ego values quite a bit, but spirit doesn't find as important, because spirit is really, again, about service, about how can I serve, how can I extend love, not am I getting love back or appreciation back. So again, it is a subtle shift, but it makes all the difference. So when I'm focused on how do I serve, then that's a very different focus than am I being served by this person or experience or situation. So how do I serve? Again, whether or not I'm being compensated financially, to me, is not that important, because many of us don't honestly necessarily find the financial compensation enough to make us happy. It helps us survive, we pay the bills with it, but if you look at people with huge bank accounts and huge incomes, that's not necessarily going to create a sense of peace and joy. So what brings peace and joy, again, is this attitude of service. How am I using my talents, my time, my resources to try and serve others as best as I can? And for me, every time, guaranteed, this lifts me up. If I find myself in a point in time in my life where I am lost, where I'm feeling down, where I can't seem to pull myself out of a dark night of the soul is what I'm referring to, then figuring out how I can better be of service to God. And how do I serve God? I serve others. Figuring that out always pulls me out of that experience. So this is what I wanted to share with you today. And I shared with you a few different methods or ways of viewing that practice. Now, it is a practice. So this is something that our egoic perspective, which we've practiced much longer, and which the world embraces. So when you talk to your friends, when you talk to your parents, when you talk to most people who are not on a deep spiritual path, they will speak to you from the egoic perspective. And, oh, that's an awful job, you should quit. Oh, that person's no good for you. Oh, your children need to respect you and listen to you, whatever it might be, whatever their narrative is. This talk is inviting you to invite in a different way of seeing things. Now, here's the important part is very often when we see things differently, people begin behaving differently. Not always, but very, very often this can be the case. That once we have decided to see things differently, again, what A Course in Miracles states is that we're actually inviting a perspective in. What we are perceiving is what we want to see. And again, I understand from a conventional viewpoint, that doesn't make any sense, because most of us will say, I don't want to see this. I want to see world peace. I want to see justice for all. I want to see whatever it is. But the spiritual truth that we want to embrace here that gives us power is accepting the truth of that. And then once we accept that, okay, what I'm seeing, I don't like what I'm seeing. And I am going to change that. I'm going to see something else and experience something else. That gives us power. And that's the really important part of adopting this view, is if I accept that everything in my experience is something that maybe on an unconscious level I have chosen, then that allows me to ultimately choose something else. And therein is the power of this. All right, everyone. I hope you find this talk helpful. I'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts? What are your experiences? I would like to thank everyone who helps support the work that I do. If you're on YouTube, you can do that by liking, subscribing, and commenting. If you'd like to go a step further, you can become a patron of mine on Patreon, and it's really the patrons who make these talks possible, so you can actually thank them for this talk. You can also make a one-time donation on Venmo or PayPal if you like. Thanks again, everyone. Until next time, namaste, and have a beautiful day.